will stay beyond August 2010 and will be renamed so-called Advisory and Assistance Brigades. Gareth Porter joins us with Pratap Chatterjee here in New York. His latest article is called "Despite Obama's Vow, Combat Brigades Will Stay in Iraq." So, Gareth Porter, how do you know this, and what exactly is the plan as you understand it?
Well, the evidence of this plan to continue to keep combat brigades in Iraq past the August 31st deadline is very clear from looking into the military planning that has been done with regard to the brigade combat teams. The basic combat organization of the U.S. Army in Iraq for the past 6 years. So I basically began to talk to some of the people who've been close to the military planning, specifically in the U.S. Army, over the past few months. And there's no secret about this, in fact. What's happening is that the basic combat organization in Iraq, the Brigade Combat Team, is going to be slightly revamped by adding a few dozen, perhaps more than that, officers who will be doing the advising and assistance directly with the Iraqi military and police, perhaps some other institutions as well, it's not clear. But they will be added on top of the existing Brigade Combat Team, rather than having any fundamental change in the structure of those organizations in Iraq. So what we have is the same combat potential, same combat organization, which will remain on the ground in Iraq. Now, there will be some drawdown, there's no doubt about that. But the promise that President Obama made on February 27th that all combat brigades would be withdrawn from Iraq, that simply is not true. It's not going to happen.
In other words, we're not dealing with a situation that most people associate with non-combat troops, like engineers or construction units that are involved in some kind of infrastructure work. These are actually combat units just renamed.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it's not even that there's going to be military advisors who will be out in the field, you know, with the Iraqi units, which I think everyone understood would be the case. When they decided to call these now, they're renaming the Brigade Combat Teams the Advisory and Assistance Brigades. So, I mean, it's the sleight of hand administratively that is being used now to cover the fact that essentially nothing has changed except the addition of, as I say, a relative handful of advisors who will be added to the structures that already exist. But it's not just people out in the field advising. It's going to be the same infantry units, the same infantry companies that exist today in Iraq will still be there when the United States is supposedly bringing its combat troops or its combat brigades home.
Gareth Porter, I wanted to play for you a comment from Defense Secretary Robert Gates. On March 1st, he appeared on Meet the Press and was asked about the 50,000 troops President Obama plans to keep in Iraq after August 2010.
They do have a very different mission, but their mission will be principally a training, assistance, advisory role. There will be a limited counterterrorism operations aspect to it, and we will still have some soldiers embedded with Iraqi units as part of the training effort. But it's a very different kind of arrangement, and our soldiers will be consolidated into a limited number of bases in order to provide protection for themselves and for civilians who are out working in the Iraqi neighborhoods and countryside as well. They will be called Advisory and Assistance Brigades. They won't be called Combat Brigades.
Gareth Porter.
Well, of course, this was a very broad hint about what was to come. That is to say, he was essentially broadcasting indirectly, without saying so explicitly, that the plan was to rename the Brigade Combat Teams Advisory and Assistance Brigades a term that does not have combat in it in order to suggest that there's been a fundamental change in the structure of the units that are being deployed in Iraq. And of course, it's quite the opposite, in fact. So the real question here is why the corporate news media did not pick up on this obvious hint and begin to look into this question and report what the real plan was for relabeling these units as non-combat units, which are in fact going to be continue to be combat units. In fact, what is really interesting here is that last December, as I point out in my article, the New York Times published an article which reported on planning that was being done in the Pentagon to relabel the existing units, combat units in Iraq, as non-combat units. And this was going to be, as the Times reported, a way in which the military could appeal to Obama to carry out his campaign promise, but still continue to keep combat brigades in Iraq. So this is exactly what has happened. But what's interesting is that there's been absolutely no reporting until my story published yesterday on the fact that this prediction by the New York Times back in December has now been realized.
Protap Chatterjee, I'd like to ask you also about the issue of military contractors in Iraq, and obviously they're also in Afghanistan in extensive numbers. And you were saying in the break you were seeing comparisons with some of the same problems in the United States occupations in both countries.
Well, in addition to the troops that Gareth mentioned, there are civilian police trainers and there are civilian army military trainers who accompany, Afghan units in Afghanistan and Iraqi units in Iraq, and they do training on the ground. And so they are looking, in fact, the CEO of DynCorp in his last investor call about a month ago said, we're looking forward to actually a lot more work in Afghanistan based on what's happening. This is in February of 2009. So the contractors are expecting a boom because they expect, to augment the military training teams. They do this. There's, as I mentioned, the focused district development training scheme in Iraq. In Afghanistan. It's actually sometimes very hard to keep these training schemes separated, because when you look at them, it's the same trainers, it's the same companies, and in fact, interestingly enough, when you look at the GAO reports, the Department of Defense Inspector General reports, the same problems. Whether you look, at Fallujah or Najaf and the training problems that they had back in 2003, or the problems they're having today in Khost and Paktika and Afghanistan, the same problems keep recurring. I keep thinking I'm reading a report about Iraq from 2003, and I suddenly realize I'm reading a GAO report from 2008.
Now, this issue of continued policy from Iraq, which President Obama condemned. I mean, he was opposed to the war in Iraq, to Afghanistan. Gareth Porter, I wanted to ask you about this. I was on a flight from Grand Rapids this past weekend, and I sat next to a military consultant, been in the military for a long time, then aerospace industry, now a consultant. And he said, yes, this is great for the military contractors, the war. But he said, as an American, he is baffled by President Obama pushing this surge and expanded war in Afghanistan. He said he is shocked by it, as many in the military are. And I wanted to ask you, Gareth, about, Lieutenant General Eikenberry, who has been nominated to be the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. He is the former top U.S. commander in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007, now would be the main diplomatic representative for the United States.
Yes, this is part of a trend not simply to have high-ranking military officers play some of the key policy roles and even diplomatic roles in the Obama administration. Of course, there's James Jones as the National Security Advisor, as well as the Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair. But in the case of Eikenberry as the new ambassador in Afghanistan, this is disturbing for more than one reason. He is both a very enthusiastic supporter of the idea that that this should be a NATO affair in Afghanistan, that this should be a NATO war. And one of those who has been pushing the idea that unless NATO can show success in Afghanistan, then it's going to be in serious trouble as an institution. So there's a question of whether some of these people are pushing the war in part, at least, because of their affinity to NATO.
Gareth Porter and Pratap Chatterjee, I want to thank you very much both for being with us. That does it for our broadcast. We begin our Standing Up to the Madness tour. We'll be in Seattle and Olympia, Washington on Sunday, Washington, D.C. on Monday. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.